What do you want to hear from the DNC this week?
You know, I'm not really looking for particulars on issues because I no longer believe a politician when they tell me what their priority is. What I am truly listening for is how they are going to reach across the aisle.
I'm looking for what they're going to do for the average American, the working class person. For health care, you know, the unemployment debacle that's going on right now.
How big of a moment is this for him to really speak to voters like you?
I think it's a huge moment, not only for voters like me, but for the American people. I mean, do we want to go with what we've had the last 3.5 years, almost 4 years? Or do we want to, you know, with everything that's going on, do we want to switch gears and see what's going to happen?
In 2008, did you vote?
I absolutely voted in 2008.
In 2012, did you vote?
Yes, proudly.
In 2016, did you vote?
I did not. Yeah, I just was not convinced. And not only was I not convinced, but there was nothing that I felt like I could support or kind of like get behind. So what's different for me now is the conversation. At the top of my list and everybody else's list is definitely police reform, and police reform in the way of how people are policed. Just that, right? Just, again, opening up the lines for that conversation because it's so polarized right now.
Particularly in 2016, the Democrats lost a lot of union support. What happened there, and how can they win union voters back?
What Trump did very, very well, and I think he should get credit for this, is he spoke to that feeling of being ignored that a lot of people were feeling, I think. I think bringing in Biden's experience under President Obama is a helpful comparison because you can just do probably a 10-point bullet list of all the major things that Trump has done to attack labor and the protections that we have, and stack that against what President Obama and Joe Biden were trying to do and did during his administration.
How have you personally been impacted by COVID-19?
Well, both of our daughters have had it. Perfectly healthy 30 and 31-year-olds that came down with it at the end of February.
As you watched your two daughters struggle with severe illness, as you watched your community get hit hard by this, what has it been like to watch how this administration has handled this crisis at the same time?
It's a kaleidoscope of emotion, and right now I'm actually feeling like I'm going to tear up. That's a first, because I've gone from frustration, confusion, anger, back to frustration so many times that I'm uncomfortable with the way I feel right now about the lack of leadership.
What can Joe Biden do this week to get your vote?
Come up with one hell of a plan. One hell of a tax plan, health care plan, and a plan for the future. And also come out and talk to us.
Dasha joins us now from East Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dasha, I loved your socially distant outdoor setup there. That was great. Let's talk about the Democrats. What key groups do they have to sway to flip a place like Kent County?
Allison, Kent County has only gone blue once since Lyndon Johnson, and that was in 2008 when Biden was on the ticket with Barack Obama. So the Democratic Party here, the head of that party tells me that they are optimistic. They are cautiously optimistic that they could recreate some of that 2008 magic again, but they are going to have to convince some key demographics, some of which are actually traditionally blue voters. I'm talking union workers who may have voted for Trump in 2016 after having voted for Obama or voted third party. African-American voters who didn't turn out in 2016, like you heard from Lataro Trailer there. On top of that, they're also going to have to chip away at some of the moderate Republican vote in Kent County and in other counties like this. And there is an interesting opportunity there. As you heard, Cynthia Timmerman, the woman who talked about her daughter getting COVID there, she has been a lifelong conservative. She now calls herself a, quote, repulsed Republican because she is so frustrated with the leadership. And voters like her are going to be watching closely this week to really hear the platform, hear some actual solutions about how the Democrats plan to heal a country that is deeply wounded right now, Allison.
Dasha, how do voters there feel, particularly about how President Trump has handled the coronavirus? How will that affect their vote?
It's gotten really personal, Allison, as you heard right there. Cynthia saw two of her daughters that are both in their early 30s. They got COVID back in March. They are still in recovery from that. One of her daughters still can't walk up the stairs in her home. Jerry, another one of the voters you heard from there, when I first met him, he was staunchly in Trump's corner. He was very much planning to vote for him again in November. But since then, since he's watched the way the president has handled this pandemic, he has backed away from that support a little bit. He says he wishes there had been a national mask mandate. He wanted the president to take this a little bit more seriously. And then, of course, you have all of the economic impact from this as well that everyone is feeling in different ways. And so it's hitting home. It's hitting people's pockets. It's hitting people's families, and it's also put healthcare really in the spotlight. So a lot of the voters I talked to said they want to hear a healthcare plan because they're seeing outrageous bills. They're hearing from their neighbors, their friends and neighbors who were hospitalized, who came home to numbers that frankly terrified them. So they want to hear a real plan on healthcare now more than ever.
Health and healthcare, huge issues in the middle of a pandemic. Dasha Burns in Kent County, Michigan. Great to see you, my friend.
You too, Allison. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.